call and orders him out of the car.
Out of the car or you're going to get tased. Everything's being recorded, son. I got no problem with that. Get out of the car. Yes. Get down on the ground now. Down on the ground.
Oh my
now.
God! Stop yelling at me.
Down on the ground. Right here, facing me. Down on the ground now.
What do you mean?
Get on your belly right now.
This is what American...
Put your phone down and put your arms out to your side now.
Sergeant Frost kicks Guilford's cell phone away.
I don't have a weapon.
Hey! You can't do that! Get your hands behind your back. You're under arrest.
Just about 90 seconds before backup arrives, Sergeant Frost tases Guilford, but he's too close for it to work properly. Roughly 14 seconds later, you hear gunshots. Sergeant Frost says Guilford attacked him, hitting him repeatedly with his fist. Take a look at this slow-mo, frame by frame. You can make the scuffle out just a little more clearly.
That's the 2372, I shot one. Priority backup. EMS, I'm bleeding.
This body cam video captures Sergeant Frost at the scene, transported to the hospital with these injuries.
And the officer cleared of all wrongdoing. The prosecutor concluding that Frost was acting in self-defense, that he truly believed that he was going to be killed or have serious bodily injury. Now, among the cited evidence, there was damage to the body camera. It actually was broken off in pieces around that site. Findings that Guilford's wounds were from the front, and the trajectory of the bullets all indicated to the prosecutor's office that there indeed was a struggle. The family now filing a federal and civil lawsuit alleging the officer used excessive force, violated their son's constitutional rights, and wrongfully caused his death.
Oh, okay, those last two issues, the excessive force and the constitutional rights, let's start there. I have a lot of questions for you about this case. What constitutional rights is the family alleging this officer violated, and why excessive force?
Initially, that it was an illegal stop, that he had every right to flash his lights at the police officer. They say the law says that. According to the Michigan driver's booklet, you can't flash your lights, your high beams at an oncoming car when it's within 500 feet, that it is illegal. That's why the officer pulled him over. That's a traffic
Isn't
stop.
this also in dispute? It's that the wording is a little nebulous. You can't glare your lights in Michigan, but flashing might be something that is acceptable. Isn't that sort of where the rub is?
That's what they're saying, and the law is a little nebulous, you're right, inconclusive, but the traffic book that you read before you take your exam says it's illegal.
Okay, so that's interesting for a lot of our viewers, because I think every one of us drives and flashes a light at oncoming,
Yeah, that's Michigan.
This is Michigan. What I need to figure out here, Jean, is after this incident, if the allegation is that the stop wasn't legal, what about everything that transpired after? Because this escalated from traffic to misdemeanor to felony. What about all those subsequent dominoes?
So the officer asked him for his driver's license. He refuses. He asked him 7 times for his driver's license, by the way.
By the way, you have to give it. If you're driving a vehicle and an officer asks you, you don't have the right to say no.
And in Michigan, it's a misdemeanor. So that elevated it to a misdemeanor. Then he asked him to step out of the car. Doesn't do that. And he was arresting him at that point based on the misdemeanor. That escalated it into a felony situation. Resisting arrest, okay. Exactly. And then you saw that struggle.
So now, once we've gone from traffic stop to misdemeanor for not providing your identification as a driver, to, was it the felony when you're resisting arrest? Mm-hmm. Okay, it's a felony resisting arrest. He's now down on the ground, and he still believes he's got the right to continue his videotaping and won't let go of his phone. That is clearly not your right. Let's just be really clear for viewers. You're not allowed to just hold your phone and continue to videotape. By that point, the resist becomes very physical, and the officer says he becomes in a struggle for his life.
That's right, and the officer's intent was to use the taser, but the taser didn't work because, according to the prosecutor's report, the taser was too close to the body. Prosecutors say that then allowed the young man to stand up, and as you saw on some of those freeze frames there, to strike the officer. Now, the family disagrees, saying that they do not believe that their son at all hit the officer.
Wow. That video
so they question those injuries.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yes, they do.
Well, there are a lot of questions for our other legal experts. The lawyer yourself, you know exactly what to look for. Jean Casares, thank you for that. Coming back after the break, I'm going to speak with the attorney for Deven Guilford's family about the traffic stop that she says should never have happened at all. Most of us do this. We flash our lights at oncoming cars when they don't dim their bright lights and it seems kind of blinding. But in the situation that we're talking about right now, a 17-year-old teenager ended up shot and killed by a policeman after he did just that. One of the biggest questions is, why didn't 17-year-old Deven Guilford just cooperate with the police officer when he was stopped? Here's a look at some of that exchange.
You have two choices. You can hit the program and start to comply with this traffic stop, or you're going to be taken to jail. Those are your two choices. Driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance, please.
I do not have my license, sir. I am going to get it.
You don't have your driver's license?
I do not have it.
Why is that?
Because I just drove my brother to the church.
You do not have your driver's license on your person, correct?
Yes, I do.
Where is it?
You do not have to see it.
One of the attorneys for Deven Guilford's family is joining me live now to talk a little bit more about this. Cynthia Heenan, thank you so much for being with me today. I do have so many questions about this case. Can I ask you why it is Deven's family believes that Deven was not at fault or that Deven's actions may not have led to the conclusion that the officer fired justifiably?
Well, from our perspective, it's quite clear, I think, watching the video, that the police officer escalated the encounter throughout that short period of time. Initially, Deven, as you can see, just thought he was doing something helpful, being a good citizen, and instead of that being recognized, he's being argued with and berated, and I think probably in his view being treated like a criminal.
So, Ms.
He's a young man, obviously.
I do hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying, but I do take issue with the police being the party that escalated this. It seemed to me when I watched that in its entirety, that officer asked very nicely 7 times for your client's son to provide him with a driver's license. And that's not negotiable. You have to do that, and it becomes a legal issue for the officer when a driver won't do that. So did the driver escalate this incident, or did the officer escalate this incident?
Well, I take issue with your position that he was required to produce his driver's license because under Michigan and federal law, it is legal to refuse an unlawful police order, and as we've indicated, we don't think the stop was legal. But the main point is that the officer had so many different opportunities to resolve the situation, de-escalate the situation. He'd already called for backup, and as you know, backup arrived within a minute of the shooting. And in addition, the officer had admittedly, and you hear it in the tape, stopped 2 other motorists that evening for doing the same thing. So clearly he knew either he was driving with his brights on intentionally, or he at least knew that this new vehicle he was driving had extraordinarily bright lights. And
it seems like the language in Michigan will have to be questioned here, because it is not 100% clear that you can't flicker your lights at an officer. The wording is glaring, so that will be an issue. But again, I have to take issue with the fact that that was the reason for the initial stop. The reason for the arrest was the non-complicity with the officer, and an officer has a right to ask a driver if he believes there's some kind of probable cause for a driver's license. It is a privilege to drive. It is not a constitutional right to drive. The passenger has a different issue altogether. If there were one, there wasn't. But in this instance, the officer himself said on the tape that Deven could have had an entirely different outcome if he had just complied with the request, give me your driver's license.
Well, I assume at that point the officer wasn't intending to shoot Deven, obviously. But
I think it's very fair to say, Cynthia, that the officer wasn't intending to shoot Deven. He had stopped several other people for the exact same thing, as you correctly pointed out, that there was no intention to shoot anybody that night.
I think one of the issues that this case presents is the assumption, which I hear you making, that every citizen has an absolute duty to acquiesce 100% to police authority, and we live in a law and order culture where that is the presumption, and there is also zero risk or zero tolerance for any risk to police officers. And I think that is the combination of those attitudes is what is leading to the epidemic of people being killed by police in this country.
Well, you're the lawyer. I'm not. I'm just a journalist trying to get to the bottom of what is an extraordinarily tragic situation. And, you know, we often say if people would just comply with what officers are asking when the request is pretty simple, we wouldn't have these escalations and then a situation where the officer, you know, ends up in the ambulance with a bloody face saying that he was trying to defend his life. I think it's very troublesome how this escalated. You know, and we'll have to see how this... will you come back on the program as this case proceeds if it does?
I'd be happy to.
Thank you, Cynthia Heenan, joining us live in Michigan regarding this case. So we have looked at it from both sides now, but how likely is this to play out in court? Well, there is a whole different set of reasoning because it's 12 people just like you, who sit in a jury box. Again, if it ever goes to court in the first place. That's next.
This is my body of proof.
Proof of less joint pain.
A remarkable scene, though, developing there. I want to get back to that other story that we just left you with before the break. It was that senseless death of a teenager in Michigan, just 17 years old. Here he is in better times, pulled over, though, by an officer after flashing his lights. After that, not complying with the officer's orders. I just spoke with one of the attorneys for the teenager's family. That family is now suing for wrongful death. HLN legal analyst Joey Jackson is here. The attorney seemed to concentrate this entire case, Joey, on the initial stop, almost as though everything afterwards doesn't count. If that stop wasn't legal, then that officer had no right to ask for the driver's license. I'm no lawyer, but I know you have to give a driver's license when asked.
You really do.
If you're the driver.
Sure. I mean, from the human element, there's a child dead, and you know, in recognition of that, it's horrible, and the family must feel, you know, just can't imagine.
Devastated.
From a legal perspective, though, you have to look. I always say, Ashley, to every client who asks and people who don't, comply now and grieve later. And so what happens is that you have to look at the points of escalation. You have a stop. You're going to debate the legalities of it. The issue is there was a flashing, a triggering of a light, and the officer felt it inappropriate, and in light of that, stopped him. At that point, he asked him several times for the license. There's a lack of compliance. He gets out of the car, doesn't want to come out of the car, the officer orders him out. There's a lack of compliance. He's out of the car, the officer says, get down. There's no compliance. The officer says, get the cell phone away. There's no compliance. It escalates from there. Now, we don't see the critical 14 seconds on that video, but if you blow it up frame by frame, it appears as though there's some kind of altercation. Now, what we do know also is that there was a medical examiner who examined, and apparently the shots were from the front. The shots the officer fired were frontal shots, and the trajectory, there was an indication of some type of struggle. So the question then becomes, was the officer in reasonable fear for his life, such that he needed to act in a deadly way? And that's going to address the lawsuit, whether or not they have a suit. But from the looks of that tape, it appears as though the officer acted in accord with what the officer needed to do under those circumstances.
And to be so clear, the attorney, you know, no disrespect, and I am not a lawyer, but it is not your right to refuse to hand over your driver's license if an officer's at your window asking. Assert your rights in court later.
Absolutely. Yeah. Assert your rights. You think the officer did something wrong, you think you don't like the way you're treated, go to court, let your lawyer resolve it, don't take it into your hands. But the case is going to turn on what happened outside of that car, and was the officer in imminent fear for his life such that he needed to fire? If the question is yes, the lawsuit goes away.
Every one of us with children is just so disconcerted when we see this kind of thing. 17 years old. Joey Jackson, thank you for that.
Thank you,
I only want to interrupt because I want to go back to our breaking news. We're just compiling some additional information. Here's the wide shot outside of that apartment building. You can see how